Today's topic is an alternative view and proposal for India 2047. Hello, everyone. Good to be with you again. Today, we are very fortunate to have with us a distinguished Indian personality, a former IAS officer, and now a development analyst. And he's written a book, and he will tell us what's in that book. Over to you, Mr. Kaul.
Thank you, Mr. Mathur. As some of you perhaps know, my book, An Alternative Development Agenda for India, has recently been published by Routledge. It had a London and New York edition, and it came into the South Asia edition in April. And the basic motive to write the book is because I firmly believe that India needs a fresh approach to tackling its challenges. It is not that since the liberalization of the 1990s, we've not had reasonable economic growth. And this year, in fact, India's GDP growth is to have clocked 7.2%, arguably the most uh, highest growth in the globally. And you could also say that within the fiscal constraints, successive governments, both at the center and the state, along with this reasonably satisfactory growth, have had a large number of welfare programs for the poor. And so then why do you need an alternative approach? And, and the answer is that while all this has happened, several disturbing signs have emerged that need a fresh rethink on our overall approach. And this is what I'd like to talk about. And the basic logic is that India needs to grow at not at 6 and 6.5%, but at 8.5%. If it has to aspire to become, say, even a middle income country in the next 2 decades. So even if you have to reach, say, a 12,000, 10,000 per dollar income, like China already has, we need to grow much faster than 6.5%. The other concern is that along with growth, we've also had a spiraling unequalness of wealth distribution, with bottom 20%, even the most conservative estimates would say bottom 20% are mired in poverty. And our policies have not provided gainful employment to large sections of the population. In fact, estimates suggest that as many as 30-40% of our youth would not be gainfully employed. Your human development indicators are certainly improved, but yet India ranks as low as 132 in the Human Development Index. And there is evidence that in the last 3 years, especially during the beginning of the COVID years, India's rank have even declined.
Yeah.
And a significant section of the population, especially in urban settlements, reside in conditions that can only be described as unlivable. So the sad reality is that despite these large number of welfare programs, and during the course of my research in the book, I counted more than 400 of these welfare programs, they do very little to enhance the productive capacity of households or improve their human development indicators. Therefore, my basic argument is that we need to move away from an almost exclusive focus on GDP growth and move towards what I call the focus on human development and livelihoods, or in general terms, into well being and livelihoods. This, I feel, is a better approach than the government's approach of growth along with welfareism. Because uh, I believe a focus on human development will not only bring in greater equity, but by enhancing the productive capacity of our people, provide the platform for a higher and more rapid GDP growth.
All right.
So, Mr. Mathur, we cannot really wait because as you know that we have a very limited 2 or 3 decades before India begins a transition to an aging society.
Great.
Our fertility rates have started dropping, and it is therefore that I argue in favor of what I call a feasible alternative people first agenda.
All right. Good. Let's hear it.
Now, so basically, in approaching this the development agenda, I focus on 6, 7 issues which I feel matter most to people. So
Okay.
these are health, education, food and nutrition, child development, because the young child is a critical uh, part of well-being. You cannot leave out gender and leave out 50% of the population. And then, of course, livelihoods and jobs. And finally, and which is what Mr. Mathur, I'll come down to your pet area, is urbanization. This approach, I believe, makes more sense than the conventional approach of looking at economic development from the prism, say, of economic sectors of agriculture, industry, services, trade, finance, and monetary policies, which conventional economists tend to do. Now, in looking at these sectors, these 7 sectors which I feel are critical to people's well-being, we need to look at them from the eyes of a typical impoverished household. Because unless you look at it from their perspective, you cannot design interventions or design programs.
Okay.
And what we found, and this has been my experience as a civil servant as well for many years, that GDP growth does not translate automatically into improving the well-being of these impoverished households. Secondly, it's easy to say that we have mismanagement and the IS and the bureaucracy is corrupt, and therefore we have poor outcomes. And my own experience suggests that this does not explain poor outcomes. In fact, my hypothesis is that it's an inadequate understanding of poverty and poor households, which flows into systemic shortcomings in the design of government programs, which lead to poor outcomes. And it's therefore not just merely a lack of budgets or allocations to the human development sectors, but also the faulty design of schemes. Uh, So
So let's
the
continue,
fundamental
please.
understanding of a poor
Yes.
household is
Yes.
why don't government programs reach them? And my hypothesis, and this is not only my hypothesis, this is borne out by a lot of research done by people like Abhijit Banerjee. There's a young economist, Mulatharan, who has written a very sliced book called Scarcity, which says that poor households are so caught up in their daily struggles that they scarcely have time to really access government programs. And unless we therefore recognize why a household is not sending a child for vaccination or sending a child to school, we cannot design a program of health or education for that child. So we therefore must begin asking, why are government services, whether it's school education or health services, not reaching the poor? Why is the service quality poor? Why is the learning outcomes in government schools so poor? And in the health sector, if you like, if I begin focusing on, my hypothesis is that conventionally government goes by global yardsticks and says we don't need even more hospitals, we need even more health centers, forgetting that the existing health facilities are themselves dysfunctional.
Mhm.
In fact, a numbers game, and successive governments are very happy in giving fresh targets. I will build 100 more new hospitals, I'll build 1,000 new schools. And that can, in fact, be an obstacle to strengthening your large public health system that you've developed over the last 50 years. So the question is, would not improving the existing healthcare network or the existing community health hospitals reduce the pressure on district level and even teaching hospitals, such as the All India Institutes? So therefore, when the government announced 17 new aims
Yeah.
in the All India Institutes, the question I asked them is that should patients be coming to AIMS? Should they
Yes.
not have been handled at a lower facility? So
Yes.
would it not be more cost effective in
Yeah.
strengthening the local hospitals rather than building a fresh, new super specialty? And similarly, in the health area, why do you wait for people to fall ill and require hospitalization? Isn't it more cost effective to design preventive and promotive healthcare systems to reduce the number of people requiring hospitalization in the first place?
Right. Okay.
Now, that's a similar kind of analysis we did when we looked at food security and malnutrition. And I've spent about 11 years in the Ministry of Food, both at the state and the center. And India spends close to as much as 3 lakhs annually on food security. It includes the world's largest public distribution system, the largest midday meals program anywhere in the world, the largest child nutrition program. And it's not the highest in absolute terms, it's the highest even in measured in per capita terms.
Right.
And yet, why do poor households, especially young children, continue to have the twin problem of large calorie deficits and huge nutrition imbalances? Obviously, it's not a lack of budgets.
No.
And it is always presumed that poverty alone can explain the situation. But there is evidence that poverty and hunger do not always go in hand. In fact, it has been incorrectly assumed that supply of cereals and supply of nutrition supplements may not tackle malnutrition. In fact, we therefore need to look at the issue a little more deeply, understand household behavior, and identify why households are not able to provide a balanced meal. Is it a lack of awareness? Because a 1 year old, 2 year old child doesn't require more than 10, 20 rupees of nutrition. Even a landless agricultural labor can afford that. So, what is coming in the way of households being able to provide that young child nourishment that he or she requires? So, therefore, the standard, in fact, here I have a little quarrel with my sector activists and right to food activists who suggest we should give even more.
Yeah.
And we found that supply of nutrition supplements under the ICDS is not really solving the problem. We have done that for the last 50, 60 years. So obviously there's something fundamentally wrong why the Indian young child has stunting levels which are more than sub-Saharan Africa, much
Yeah.
higher than what we find in Bangladesh.
Yeah.
Now let's move to school education.
Well,
And
let
this
me
is
stop you there. I'm glad you mentioned it because most people don't know that there is stunting in India.
Yeah.
Most people don't know. And when I sometimes talk about it, they say, no. I said, no, you don't know, but 30% is the stunting rate.
Yes.
And it's
Yes.
not a question of my numbers, it's well accepted numbers. And I'm glad you mentioned it because it's something that
No,
people aren't
you can
aware
live
of.
in denial. You can live in denial, and then now there is a little group which is saying, "Oh no, 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 the Indian child's DNA is different. We don't cannot measure our child based on global benchmarks." But this is all rubbish.
Yeah, yeah.
There was this.
Let's
I,
continue.
I'll
Let's
tell
not
you
get. Let's.
why it is rubbish.
Uh,
There's a young group of two Harvard young economists who did a study of children, first generation migrants into England. Okay, and they compared their uh, heights after 5, 6 years with the heights of similarly placed households in India, and
yeah,
found that in one generation the child gained in height.
yeah.
So, is it environment? Is it lack of nutritional awareness, even amongst not so poor households, which is coming in the way? Why is, for instance, anemia so rampant even amongst middle income households? Not only amongst women, even amongst men.
Mhm.
25% of Indians are anemic.
Yeah.
So these are issues which you need to go into household behavior, into nutritional imbalances. And unfortunately, when you have a 3 lakh food subsidy, all going towards supply of cereals, you take away whatever budget you could in in other kind of interventions which may have been cost effective. Now, that is the
Let me just stop you. You said 3 lakh. Do you mean 3 lakh crore?
yes.
But you said 3 lakh.
No, 3 lakh
You said
crores.
it twice, 3 lakhs. I was just
3
wondering,
lakh
what do you
crores.
mean 3
3
lakh
lakh
crore?
crores.
But 3 lakhs is
Yes.
nothing.
Yeah, 3 lakh crores.
Yeah, okay,
3 lakh
sorry.
crores.
Let's continue.
And 3 lakh crores is central government budget. The
Yeah, yeah.
state budget
Right.
would be perhaps an additional 1 lakh crore.
Yes, okay. Fine. Let's continue,
So
please.
then again, let's look at why government school performs. I'm moving to school education. Now, after all, in those of us who studied in higher education institutions in government school and government systems know that they are better than the private educational institutions. So
Yeah.
if it can happen at higher education, why is it such a bottleneck when it comes to government schools?
Mm.
And we challenge the conventional wisdom that once you open schools, provide teachers, and supply textbooks, everything will take care of itself. And we have done a lot of that under
Yeah.
Sarva Saksha Abhiyan. Progressively, school education budgets have increased. We fail to recognize again that when it comes to government schools, large clientele of the government schools are poor, uneducated household, first generation learners, and they're unable to provide a learning environment at home. If you have a child going from our educational background or our income levels, send them to the worst school, that child's learning outcomes will still be very good because you'll make up the deficit at home.
Yeah.
Now that poor child, a child from a poor household, does not have that environment at home.
Yeah.
So we need one to relook at the curriculum to make it child friendly, because the current curriculum, the poor child is really alienated. He doesn't know what is happening. The teacher is doing a rigid curriculums given from the top, unmindful of the fact that the child is already alienated from the system and loses interest and perhaps drops out. So, in fact, a lot of children from government schools are pushed out of the system because they can't relate to it.
Hmm.
How can we improve this
Yeah.
teacher autonomy?
Yeah.
And then how can we provide a supportive learning environment for children from poor households?
Yeah.
In fact, there was a study done by Abhijit Banerjee's team, uh, the that random trial that he did in Jaipur, in Rajasthan, where he found that even 2 months of remedial instruction by a bunch of volunteers can make up the learning deficit very quickly.
Yeah.
So, in fact, a recommendation that I've made is that along with government school curriculum, it's not the fault of the teacher alone. You require some kind of remedial instruction, not because the child is dim-witted or weak, but because you require a substitute or a proxy to the lack of a learning environment at home.
Yeah.
So unless we recognize that this is the problem, we will not find solutions.
Yeah.
There could be other problems. The rigid curriculum, the curriculum which is designed in cities, the child is not able to relate to the local environment. But I'm saying this is one of the set of issues. Now, human development activists have been focusing on health, nutrition, education, but I think we need to go beyond, because while human development indicators, if they improve, are great enablers, they are meaningless without livelihoods and jobs.
Okay.
And how does the government provide the livelihoods for the millions of our youth? And how does it enable women to enter the job market? Poor households are so caught up in debt and in a vicious circle of borrowing money that they really cannot find solutions for themselves,
Okay.
even with the kind of support that we get through
Hmm.
self-help groups and
Hmm.
a little bit of mudra loans. Most of them do require skills and jobs. Unfortunately, what has happened is that most of the traditional industries, whether it's handicrafts or handlooms, have seen a decline.
Yeah.
Agriculture, and I think I could argue with somebody. I've spent many years in agriculture. In fact, 14 years I was heading an agribusiness company. Uh, cannot really provide the enhanced livelihood that we want for our impoverished households.
Hmm.
In any case, the educated youth want to move away from agriculture, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's a global trend. Graduate unemployment has risen sharply. They want jobs, and feeble labor participation, currently at 24%, needs to grow much higher.
Yeah.
Now, there is mounting evidence that most decent household livelihoods and jobs, and in fact, over 50%, 70% of the future GDP growth will not come from rural areas. We can remain, uh, you know, uh, dream and continue living in denial. But we have to recognize that there are going to be limited opportunities in rural areas, and migration to towns. And you're right, Mr. Mathur, it need not be the large cities, but the smaller towns also. which has to be the first step in changing the poor household's economic trajectory. Now, we are not talking of small numbers. Estimates suggest that you require to recognize that there could be as many as 60, 70 million households which will be migrating to towns and cities in the next 15 years or so. And what do you need for them? You require multiple enablers. First, you require affordable housing, you require hygiene, you require health systems, water supply, and sewage systems, and you require an environment which supports businesses, including self-employed businesses.
Yeah.
So I think what has been missing in the economic development trajectory is a recognition that urban livelihoods has to be the focus of a development agenda, apart from human development. Now, globally, and you look at China's experience, it was driven not just through private enterprise and a competitive market, it was driven through certain directional interventions by the government to create uh, large manufacturing clusters
Yeah.
in towns and cities. And
Yeah.
we are not talking of the metros, we're talking of something like 2,000 towns and cities across the country where manufacturing hubs are created. Now, it is not as if the government does not have these kind of manufacturing clusters. They have an industrial cluster approach. Unfortunately, they miss out that when you are setting up an industrial cluster, you have to plan for people to live in it. It's not just setting up sheds. In fact, when I was in the industries department, we had this concept of setting up these industrial sheds where we created great infrastructure and water supply for the potential factories, but forgot that there are going to be people who have to move in. You have to have schools, colleges, urban infrastructure, housing, and without that, that industrial sheds are not going to attract businesses.
Yeah.
So now you have, therefore, an urban cluster approach. You have industrial cluster in the government of India, but the two never speak to each other. And this has been the problem with civil servants, that we may be very great at doing our own work, but we work in silos.
Mm-hmm.
So, therefore, these 1,000 towns, if they're identified, the urban department and the industrial department must come together and plan not only for the industrial environment around them, but also for the housing needs, the water supply needs, the storage needs, and schooling and college, so that it attracts the workforce and attracts investments.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one fundamental issue that will arise when you're dealing with this migration and the urban influx is housing.
Yeah.
And what has been the government's approach? The government's approach is, let us build for the poor.
Yeah.
Now, it works for rural areas because you've got land.
Yeah.
It doesn't work for urban areas because you don't have the kind of lands or the wherewithal or the capacity to talk about 40, 50 million housing units.
Yeah.
And if you look at Delhi, in the last 10 years, there have been perhaps about 10,000, 20,000 dwelling units for the poor.
Yeah.
Whereas you required about 4 or 5 million, at
Yeah.
least 2, 3 million.
Yeah. Yeah. True.
So you talk of 50 million households and 50 million dwelling units, you obviously have to go back to investments from the private sector.
Yeah.
And therefore, I have a rather counterintuitive proposal. So if you look at cities in India, it has been able to attract developers and builders even for the lower middle class, but fail to attract for the low income households. And low income households, when they come, they cannot afford to buy. They need rental housing. And when they don't get reasonable rental, affordable rental housing, they land up in renting a shack in a slum.
Yeah.
Now, to create that rental housing block, you will need to create an investment climate for this private real estate capital, not to build low income households, low middle class households, but make it worth the while by investing in housing, affordable housing for the poor. And then it can be used by anybody.
Yeah.
Even if a middle class household invests in that property and rents it out, it's fine. In any case, this whole business of allocating housing for the poor for them to buy is a non-starter because a low-income household costs what 10 lakhs, which a migrant household cannot afford.
No.
He can afford 5,000, 6,000 rent, or even 7,000 rent.
Yeah.
So you require. So I've talked about creation of and it's fleshed out in the book, a low-income housing market by
Yeah.
relaxing conditions,
Yeah.
FSI condition, building conditions,
Yeah.
not give housing intervention submissions for beneficiaries, but subsidies on interest and borrowing to the builders to build affordable housing. So these are the kind of strategies I've looked at.
Yeah.
Then within the urban sector, just spent another few minutes,
Yeah.
and
Sure. No problem.
I'll be done.
No.
The
No
other
problem.
set of issues that a poor household faces is transport, and that links to what the main challenge in India's towns and cities, which is congestion. Now, the Indian cities, the last 10, 15 years, have found this romantic thing that the best thing to do is create metro systems.
Yeah.
Now, not only are metro systems long gestation, high capex, but in large parts also not affordable by the real poor.
No.
And a survey in Bombay showed that 55% of Bombay's citizens don't even use a bus. They commute to work
Yeah.
by walking.
Yeah.
And what we've neglected in our public transport systems is neglected pedestrian paths and walkways,
Yeah.
and neglected bus transport. And I'm not talking of the ordinary DTC bus or the Mumbai bus, which is 15 years old. So we calculated that if you limit a metro line by just 5 kilometers, one could finance over 4,000 Volvo AC buses, which could completely change the landscape of any city's public transport system and straight away, in a year, ease congestion on the roads. A bus can take 40 passengers and it replaces 40 two-wheelers.
Yeah.
So imagine the kind of reduced congestion. So therefore, and should we continue to build flyovers? I was reading that Seoul had built a lot of flyovers, but when they wanted to really focus on easing congestion, they destroyed all the flyovers, focused on public transport. Of course, they built a efficient public transport system. They also relaxed building conditions in the proximity of metros so that high-rise buildings and congested, dense populations, commercial and residents, could come around those hubs.
Yeah.
So we require to look at transport a little more imaginative. Uh, the focus, therefore, must be on moving people rather than moving cars. Across the world, wherever roads have been built for cars, the cars have multiplied to occupy the roads.
Right.
So this is the kind of alternatives that we have suggested.
Okay.
Again, on the issue of gender, we've talked about a huge potential that exists of self-help groups. But when you do an analysis of these self-help groups, and there are millions of them which are fairly active in India, we find that 90% of them are doing credit, and they're borrowing money and in terms of need. That is not enhancing their productive capacity or enhancing incomes. Now, if you want these self-help groups or individuals in the self groups to start micro businesses, they must be supported in different ways rather than just by interest. They need hand-holding, they require education,
Yeah.
and even traditional microfinance institutions like Basics, which was the pioneer, has recognized that. Now, we do have in Government of India a Mudra loan scheme,
Yes.
but a Mudra loan scheme has become a numbers game. Uh, it is a digital product. There's no interface with the borrower in the expectation that there would be vested interest. But the casualty is the bank person does not want to give more than 30, 40,000 loan.
Yeah.
Now, average Mudra loan is less than 50,000. Now, 50,000 is not adequate even to employ that one person, let alone generate employment for others. So you require tiny businesses to flourish, and they require some minimum scale. They require scale to market. They require scale to hire employees. to get skilled people and generate sustainable employment. So the basic problem that is there, like I gave an example of Mudra, is that government programs are driven by targets and numbers, which seriously compromise the needed attention on strengthening systems, focusing on outcomes, and focusing on service quality. Now, while talking of these 7 issues, we've said that these cannot be looked at in silos like governments typically do.
Right.
It has to come as an integrated program. You
Yeah.
can't talk of health
Yeah.
without livelihoods and education or nutrition. And the other set of issues, there are 2 sets of issues before I conclude. One is when you devise these strategies, obviously it's going to cost some money.
Yeah.
And then they say that, after all, the government is doing its best. Can we compromise on defense? Can we compromise on uh, road infrastructure? Can we compromise on building highways? Certainly you cannot. But there are a lot of things that you can do better. And I calculated, in fact, it's an unusual book because in the annexure, in the technical note, I have I've identified through the book interventions, and I've then quantified in monetary terms what it will cost in a year. And I've concluded that a mere 2% additional on GDP would be adequate to fund the agenda to, to what China was able to do through the 80s and 90s
Mm.
in strengthening human development and livelihoods.
Mm-hmm.
And even the Finance Commission, the 15th Finance Commission, has recognized that the India's tax to GDP ratio is 17%, which is very low. It can easily move up to 22%.
Yeah.
So without compromising on cutting down budgets elsewhere, a little better fiscal management can find the resources not only for this development agenda, but also
Okay.
additional money for defense and infrastructure.
Okay.
So this is basically in just what I have talked about, and of course the book fleshes out these details. And the
Yeah.
idea is not that my solutions are the best.
Yeah.
The idea is that uh, uh, that there should be a debate on why things are going wrong, and that the India's potential is much greater than
Yeah.
what currently we have been experiencing in the last 2 decades or so. So I'll close here, Mr. Mathur.
Well, thank you so much for a very, comprehensive and well thought out scheme. It is certainly rare to see such a comprehensive and well thought out. It's a book, but the book is not very narrow and it is very specific. So I'm not going to say whether I agree or disagree in this channel. I don't comment like that. So I just say that, yes.
In any case, as I said, the idea is not for me to become, to convince the world. But the idea certainly is to begin a debate that things can be much better.
Certainly you have begun the debate.
And budgets alone or corruption alone is not the answer. Because if you say there are no budgets and there's corruption, then you end up, with a roadblock.
No, I am saying that, look, you have made a very good case, and it's a very strong case, I think. But it's not my job here to comment, so I won't. I will simply say that, look, I'm glad that you came and you presented these ideas, and I hope that there is a big debate about it. And maybe I'll also join in the debate with you offline. But for the moment, I'm just saying thank you for being here and for taking the effort to come and present your ideas. And is there anything else you'd like to add before we end?
Thank you very much.
No, okay, fine. Then let's say bye to let's say bye to the viewers and just say that I'll be back with another expert or another young person soon. Till then, bye.